John Kennedy wasn't a man who fit the mold of modern influence. He didn't carry a resume brimming with Ivy League credentials, didn't hold a political office, and wasn't followed by a string of press cameras. Yet, in a room full of seasoned politicians, think tank leaders, and rising stars in the activist world, it was his voice that shifted the tone of the entire gathering. He reminded everyone that power doesn't always come from position, it often comes from conviction. When he entered the Obama Presidential Center that afternoon, he was just another face in the crowd. A Vietnam veteran from Ohio, he had seen and endured things that textbooks couldn't teach. For decades, he'd lived as a quiet citizen, participating in local community boards, attending town halls, and volunteering at schools when few others showed up. In his own way, he had always been politically engaged, not by writing op-eds or trending on social media, but by showing up and speaking up when it mattered. But over the years, he had grown frustrated with the growing sense that everyday voices no longer mattered, that the national conversation was being led and shaped almost exclusively by people in power, and that ordinary Americans were expected to listen, nod, and accept decisions, without having much say in them. And that frustration brought him to Chicago not to make a scene, but to witness the conversation firsthand, to see if his fears were valid. His presence at the event was an accident of determination. He wasn't invited, didn't have a pass, and had no political connections. He had simply walked in behind a group of young interns, unnoticed, blending in just long enough to get through. He wasn't there to protest or provoke, he was there because he believed he still had the right to be part of the national dialogue. When security moved to remove him, John Kennedy didn't argue, he didn't resist. He simply asked for the chance to speak. Just one sentence, he said. That's all he wanted. In that moment, the quiet resolve of a man who felt like he had nothing left to lose, but his voice was enough to give even the most polished people in the room pause. It wasn't the volume of his words that made them powerful. It was the calm, unwavering conviction behind them. Are we still listening to people who have no title? He asked. Are we still willing to hear a voice that didn't come from Harvard, or Capitol Hill, or the evening news? In that question, John Kennedy wasn't challenging the legitimacy of those in power, he was challenging their openness. He was asking if civic space still belonged to the public, or if it had been quietly privatized by prestige and protocol. The impact of his words wasn't immediate applause. It was reflection. There were people in that room who had spent years in public, with service, but hadn't spoken with the kind of stripped-down clarity he had just displayed. For many, it was a reminder of something they hadn't thought about in a long time, that democracy is not supposed to be comfortable, it's supposed to be participatory. And participation doesn't require a badge, just a willingness to speak truth, even when it's inconvenient. John Kennedy became the embodiment of that truth. He wasn't loud and he wasn't polished, but he was real. And sometimes, the most powerful voices are the ones that don't chase influence, they simply tell the truth without fear of how it will be received. In that moment, he didn't just ask a question. He exposed a reality that many in the room hadn't confronted, that in the age of curated panels and managed access, the raw, uninvited voices of everyday Americans were growing fainter. Yet that afternoon, one of those voices broke through, and not because it demanded attention, but because it deserved it. President Barack Obama has always been known for his calm demeanor and measured responses, even in moments of unexpected tension. That day at the Obama Presidential Center, his leadership was put to the test in a subtle but significant way. The presence of John Kennedy, a man who had not been invited, who bypassed security, and who seemed out of place among the curated list of guests, could have triggered a swift and cold response. Instead, Obama chose a path that revealed the strength of true leadership, listening, even when every protocol suggested otherwise. As soon as the staff member leaned in to whisper about the unexpected guest, Obama didn't react with visible irritation. There was no flurry of orders or a demand for immediate removal. He simply nodded and gave the kind of understated direction that would keep the situation contained but respectful. He trusted the team around him to handle it discreetly. But when John Kennedy raised his hand and asked, not demanded, to say just one thing before being removed, the dynamic in the room shifted ever so slightly. Obama had every reason to deny him. The event was structured, timed, and filled with influential figures. Allowing an unverified attendee to speak posed a risk not just to order, but potentially to safety and message control. These events were designed to be secure, professional, and focused. Disruptions weren't part of the script, but in that brief moment of uncertainty, Obama made a silent decision that spoke volumes. He gave him space. It wasn't an open invitation, or an indulgence. It was a calculated gesture rooted in his understanding of civic values. Leadership isn't always about speaking first or asserting authority, it's about knowing when to allow others to be heard. As John Kennedy stood and addressed the room, Obama didn't interrupt or glance around nervously. He watched, he listened. His posture didn't change, but the people in the room could sense a kind of openness, a readiness to engage, even with someone who had bypassed every expected channel. Asterisk, what John Kennedy said wasn't confrontational. It was reflective. Are we still listening to people who have no title? He asked. That question could have been interpreted as a challenge, but Obama didn't flinch. He understood something fundamental in that moment. The comment wasn't just about power, it was about presence, about whether our public spaces were still shared, or quietly reserved for a specific class of people. Asterisk, Obama's response was not verbal at first, it was behavioral. He didn't cut the man off. He didn't gesture for security to move in. He let the man finish. That might seem like a small thing, but in politics, where control is often guarded carefully, that decision reflected confidence and humility. When Kennedy finished speaking and quietly prepared to be escorted out, it was Obama who broke the silence. Asterisk, he rose from his seat and walked toward the man, not with pomp or hesitation, but with intention. Extending his hand, he said, "We came uninvited, but you reminded us why we're here." That one sentence was enough to reshape the entire narrative of the moment. What had begun as a security breach became a civic moment. What could have been a disruption became a reflection point for everyone in the room. Asterisk, Obama's reaction wasn't about optics. It was about principle. He could have leaned on security, or decorum, or the event's agenda. But instead, he leaned on trust in the room, in his own instincts, and in the notion that real leadership means being open to surprise. It was a reminder that no amount of planning or preparation can substitute for the human qualities that define leadership. At its best, composure, empathy, and wisdom. Asterisk, John Kennedy didn't change policy that day. He didn't make a speech that would go viral. But he did bring out something revealing in Obama: the ability to adapt without losing poise, to acknowledge without condescending, and to lead not just by commanding the room, but by sharing it, even for a moment, with someone the room never expected. Asterisk. The moment John Kennedy spoke at the Obama Presidential Center, a quiet but powerful question rippled through the room. Who really gets to speak in our civic spaces? It wasn't a question posed with anger or accusation, but with genuine concern. His simple words cut through the structured format of the event and reached something deeper, an issue that often goes unnoticed in today's political landscape. Are public forums still open to the public, or have they become curated stages, reserved for only the highly credentialed and the well-connected? Asterisk, John Kennedy didn't arrive with a team or an invitation. He didn't carry a name tag, nor did he enter through the main registration desk, but he showed up anyway because, in his view, the meaning of civic space wasn't about passes or programs, but about presence. His life, shaped by military service, community work, and quiet decades of observing American democracy from the ground level, had taught him that participation isn't a privilege, it's a responsibility. Asterisk, what made Kennedy's quiet interjection so impactful wasn't that it came out of nowhere, but that it came from somewhere deeply human and familiar. He didn't have a microphone or a stage, but he had something more important, a lived sense of what it means to be a citizen. When he raised his hand and asked, with respectful resolve, for permission to say a single sentence, the message behind his words was already clear even before he spoke. Asterisk, that single sentence, "Are we still listening to people who have no title?" landed with unexpected weight. In that question was a challenge to the structure of the very room he was standing in. Not a hostile challenge, but a civic one. A challenge to reflect on whether the institutions designed to be by and for the people were still accessible to people like him, those without professional clout, speaking roles, or media presence. Asterisk, civic spaces are often described as open, but the reality is more complex. Over time, these spaces have quietly shifted toward exclusivity, shaped by invitation lists, press credentials, speaking fees, and formal hierarchies. Even events that aim to be inclusive can feel intimidating to the everyday person who may not know the language of policy, or who lacks the connections to be considered a thought leader. John Kennedy's presence, his very act of standing up, broke that pattern. Asterisk, his question reminded everyone that the foundation of civic dialogue isn't built on titles or fame. It's built on the principle that every voice matters, particularly the voices that aren't often heard. He wasn't there to be disruptive. He didn't speak for long. He didn't campaign, criticize, or promote an agenda. He simply asked if there was still room for someone like him, a veteran, a citizen, an American without influence, to be heard. Asterisk, and in that brief exchange, something shifted. The silence in the room after he spoke was not one of discomfort, but of reflection. People looked at each other, unsure of what to say next. The event, so carefully timed and planned, paused. Not out of confusion, but because what had just occurred mattered. It was real. It wasn't on the script. And yet, it struck the core of what civic duty is meant to be. Asterisk, even President Obama, known for his thoughtful composure, took a moment before responding. His gesture walking over to John Kennedy, shaking his hand, and inviting him to stay was more than an act of respect. It was an acknowledgement that civic legitimacy doesn't come from a guest list. It comes from participation, from the courage to speak even when the room wasn't expecting you. Asterisk. The rest of the evening continued, but it did so under a different tone. Conversations afterward revolved not around policy points, but around the moment a quiet man named John Kennedy asked a question that everyone, in some way, had forgotten to ask. He didn't dominate the room. He didn't need to. He reminded everyone why the room existed in the first place. Asterisk. John Kennedy's presence at the Obama Presidential Center wasn't planned. It wasn't anticipated by the organizers, nor was it part of any scheduled moment. Yet it became the most memorable part of the entire day. Not because he made a scene, or stole the spotlight, but because in the span of a few quiet words, he delivered something more impactful than most speeches could. He gave the room a reason to pause, and sometimes, that pause carries more weight than a headline ever could. Asterisk. There was something remarkable about how it all unfolded. He didn't raise his voice or wave his arms. He didn't interrupt a speaker or argue with staff. He simply stood there, still and composed, and asked for a moment before being escorted out. When he began to speak, his tone was steady, his words deliberate. Are we still listening to people who have no title? It wasn't a plea, and it wasn't a protest. It was a question that seemed to settle into the walls of the room and linger there. Asterisk. In that moment, the conversation stopped not because it was forced to, but because it needed to. Kennedy didn't say much else, and he didn't need to. His message wasn't about volume or length. It was about timing, tone, and truth. Everyone in the room, activists, scholars, elected officials, and former President Obama himself, recognized the significance of what had just happened. A man who technically wasn't supposed to be there had just asked the most important question of the day. Asterisk. What followed wasn't applause or chatter. It was silence. A respectful, thoughtful silence. The kind that follows a statement that says exactly what needed to be said, something so clear and true that no immediate response feels adequate. John Kennedy didn't bask in that silence. He didn't try to fill it. He simply nodded, as if to say, "That's all I came for," and began to step aside, ready to accept whatever came next. Asterisk. But something unexpected happened. President Obama, known for his ability to command a room with eloquence, chose not to speak immediately. He stood, walked over to Kennedy, and extended a hand. The gesture was simple, but its meaning was unmistakable. "You came uninvited," he said, "but you reminded us why we're here." There were no theatrics in Obama's voice, no performancy, just an honest recognition that something important had just taken place. Asterisk. That moment wasn't planned. It wasn't rehearsed, and it certainly wasn't publicized, but it became the quiet turning point of the entire event. Not because it altered the agenda, but because it subtly elevated the conversation. For the rest of the day, people weren't just talking about policy proposals or generational trends. They were talking about John Kennedy. Not in the way people talk about celebrities or influencers, but in the way people talk about a message. They can't forget. Asterisk. The impact of what he said didn't come from charisma or credentials. It came from sincerity. He wasn't trying to impress anyone. He wasn't there to be seen. He was there to be heard. Just once in being heard, he became unforgettable. It's often the quietest moments that linger the longest. A sentence spoken without notes, without a platform, without any expectation of praise, can sometimes land deeper than an hour-long keynote. Asterisk. John Kennedy never raised his voice, and yet he changed the tone of the room. His question didn't lead to debate, it led to reflection. That's a rare power, especially in a world where people are constantly competing to be the loudest. He didn't argue, he didn't demand. He didn't even stay at the center of attention after he spoke. He took a seat in the back of the room and listened. Asterisk. Yet it was clear that his words were still echoing in the minds of those around him. Conversations softened, people leaned in more closely to one another. There was a different kind of attentiveness in the air, not just toward the speakers, but toward the purpose of the gathering itself. Because in a moment that lasted less than a minute, John Kennedy reminded everyone that the most profound contributions to civic life don't always come with fanfare. Sometimes they come from a quiet voice, heard at exactly the right time. Asterisk. As the event at the Obama Presidential Center drew to a close, people mingled in the hallways, exchanging cards, summaries, and carefully crafted reflections. Panels had been concluded, discussions wrapped up, and staff were already beginning to pack up equipment. Yet amidst the usual closing chatter, one name kept surfacing. Not a scheduled speaker, not a guest of honor, but John Kennedy, the uninvited guest whose quiet question left a lasting impression. Asterisk. His brief appearance hadn't disrupted the date, had defined it. Long after the microphones were turned off and the cameras had stopped rolling, his words lingered in the minds of those who had witnessed the moment. Are we still listening to people who have no title? It wasn't dramatic, but it was deeply honest. It didn't criticize anyone by name, but it forced everyone to look inward, and that, perhaps, is why it stayed with people. Asterisk. In the end, what John Kennedy reminded the room, and perhaps the country, is that democracy doesn't just live in grand speeches or carefully planned events. It lives in unexpected moments, in voices that come from outside the spotlight, in questions that rise not from authority but from experience. His presence brought a kind of raw sincerity that cannot be rehearsed, and his message asked something that institutions often overlook: who gets to be heard when decisions are being made? President Obama's response, measured, respectful, and open, showed what real leadership looks like in the face of an unplanned moment. He didn't shut it down. He didn't shift the focus. He embraced it. And in doing so, he validated the very question Kennedy asked. That handshake, that acknowledgement, became a symbol of something bigger than one man or one event. It became a small but potent reminder that respect, humility, and civic openness are still possible even in highly controlled spaces. John Kennedy didn't leave the center with applause or a camera crew following him. He slipped out the way. He came in quietly, but the echo of his words had already done their work. Conversations were different. People were quieter, more thoughtful. It was as if the entire event had been gently nudged back toward its core purpose: public service, civic engagement, and the importance of listening. In a time when political discourse is often dominated by polished soundbites and combative headlines, Kennedy's calm demeanor and honest inquiry cut through with rare clarity. He wasn't a politician, a pundit, or a celebrity. He was a citizen, and that, in the most meaningful way, made all the difference. Sometimes the loudest impact doesn't come from the center of the stage but from the edge of the room, where someone stands up not to be seen but simply to be heard. And when that voice speaks truth with humility, even the most powerful